We have reported extensively on alleged human rights abuses committed by Russian forces during the invasion of Ukraine. It is just one piece of a larger picture of people on the planet who are in peril. Human Rights Watch exposes violations of human rights, and it pushes to hold those offenders accountable. For the past 3 decades, Kenneth Roth has stood at the helm of Human Rights Watch. This week, he is stepping down, and tonight, he's joining us. Ken, it's good to have you on the program. As it is in the news business, we have breaking news we need to report, and we are getting reports now out of Russia that former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev has died. I don't know if you've heard that, but we just got the report. And I wanted to ask you, he was seen, at least in the West, as a symbol of hope and change for more human rights behind the Iron Curtain. Your thoughts on the news of his passing?
He was really a visionary leader. His so-called glasnost represented the first opening in the former Soviet Union. It really began the process of free speech that I think ultimately led to the end of the Soviet Union. That together with his perestroika, which was his, economic liberation from the state control, the communist control of the economy, really began a transformation process, which, ended with the split of the Soviet Union into its 15 constituent parts. And frankly, that's a big part of what is motivating Putin today as he invades Ukraine. He's never accepted the breakup of the Soviet Union. He still thinks that, Ukraine and Belarus and parts of Kazakhstan are really just, Bolshevik creations that he's entitled to resurrect because there are some ethnic Russian speakers there. So, Gorbachev was an amazing leader, but of course, the ripple effect of his leadership is still being felt today, some positively, some negative ways.
Yeah, and the era of Gorbachev 30 years ago, it seems like a world away, and that was the world in which you began your time at Human Rights Watch. Talk to me a little bit, compare for me, if you can, what your scope of work has been, what it has changed compared to 30 years ago and what it's like today.
Well, Human Rights Watch actually began as an effort to protect the human rights defenders in the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc who had begun their work with the Helsinki Accords of 1975 and were promptly suppressed. And so Helsinki Watch, which is the precursor to Human Rights Watch, was really an effort to protect them. And that, spoke to an era where being a human rights activist was still relatively rare. There were activists around the world, but they were a weak, embattled bunch. And I think the biggest evolution that I've seen in the 3+ decades that I've been involved in the human rights movement is that today there are human rights defenders in almost every country. Maybe the most repressive ones like North Korea, there's no one who can survive there, but they even, in that case, operate in exile. And so we have a movement that really is able to push back against this inevitable tendency of governments to violate human rights. When you couple that with the fact that today it's very difficult for governments to hide their repression, there are smartphones and access to social media virtually every place. It does mean that the human rights movement is able to generate very significant pressure on governments that violate human rights. We don't always win by any means, but there is a cost to human rights violations that we're able to impose.
What worries you the most, Ken, when you think about the present and the future of human rights in our world?
Well, today there really is a global contest between democracy and autocracy, between governments that are really, at least in theory, built around respect for human rights, and those that are built primarily around the retention of power. In some sense, this is playing out in Ukraine, but I think in many ways the most dangerous threat to the global defense of human rights is China. Because, nobody wakes up in the morning and wants to live in Putin's, kleptocratic autocracy. But the Chinese government does present itself as a supposedly superior model to democracy, one that, isn't impeded by the messiness of democracy, one that can think longer term. But of course, any autocracy, because it's not answerable to its people, primarily serves itself. And we're seeing this today where the Chinese Communist Party is is pursuing a series of policies, economic, COVID, and the like, which is really about retaining power. But what worries me is that the Chinese government, has both the ideological inclination and the economic power to try to persuade or coerce governments around the world to defend itself. And that, I think, today is perhaps the biggest battle that the human rights movement faces.
The New York Times has called you the godfather of human rights work. I mean, that speaks to the enormous respect that you have earned in your career. Obviously, you've attracted criticism as well. And I'm thinking about Human Rights Watch equating Israel's policy toward the Palestinians with the concept of apartheid. The Jerusalem Post recently quoted NGO Monitor President Gerald Steinberg as saying that in his 30-year reign as head of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth has obsessively distorted and exploited human rights to demonize Israel. What's your take on that, Ken? I mean, you've had years to try to find a solution to this. Have you been able to change minds there?
Well, first, I should say the guy you just quoted, devotes his entire career to criticizing anybody who criticizes Israel. Yeah. In his view, the Israeli government has never in the history of the world committed a human rights violation. So, this is not a credible source. But Human Rights Watch applies the same fact-finding, the same standards to Israel as we do every place else. In the case of Israel, we applied the international legal definition of apartheid as contained in 2 treaties. And if you look at the facts, it's not even close. When Human Rights Watch issued our report, the Israeli government couldn't find anything wrong with it. They just resorted to name calling of the sort that you just cited. But, we get this all the time. Governments, when they can't defend their record, try to attack the messenger. And Human Rights Watch tries to be extremely careful. We are objective and meticulous in our fact-finding. And then as carefully and as principled way as possible, we apply human rights law. Governments don't like that. We're attacked. I've been personally sanctioned by the Chinese and the Russian governments. We're attacked by the Rwandan government, the Ethiopian government. I could go on and on. That's just what happens. When governments have nothing to say for themselves, they attack Human Rights Watch.
Yeah, and speaking of China, today the Chinese Foreign Ministry had offered some words of advice for the United States regarding gun violence and human rights. Take a listen to what was said.
The US needs to face up to its poor human rights conditions regarding gun violence and take concrete action on gun control to stop the violence and protect the American people's right to life, rather than go around criticizing other countries and using human rights as a pretext to meddle in their internal affairs.
Obviously, the irony there is obvious, Ken, but when you hear this, what worries you the most looking forward? The growing influence of China and this authoritarian system, or the weakening influence of the United States as a moral authority and defender of human rights?
Well, look, first of all, the U.S. does have a gun violence problem. This is a product of the U.S. Supreme Court's extreme interpretation of the Second Amendment. But, that should not preclude, no government is perfect. And governments that, attempt to respect human rights in many respects should stand up and defend human rights around the world, particularly in a place like China, where there's not even the pretense of respect for human rights. Nobody has the right to speak out. Nobody can vote for their leader. They don't even have economic and social rights. China pretends that human rights are nothing more than the size of the economy. So, this is a very simplistic view of human rights. So I don't believe that somebody has to be perfect in order to defend human rights, but rather, everybody should scrutinize themselves, but then devote themselves to protecting human rights around the world. And I frankly wish that the U.S. did that more regularly, rather than, for example, President Biden's recent fist bump with the Saudi crown prince.
Yeah, that was reported on a lot, and the implications of that fist bump. What about climate change, Ken? What can that mean? What should it mean for the future of human rights?
Well, climate change is a big threat, obviously. Many people are going to face displacement due to climate change. They're going to face impoverishment. And I think there is a real responsibility, both to curtail the dumping of carbon into the atmosphere and making things worse, but also, particularly the wealthier countries that have done so much to contribute to climate change, they really have a responsibility to try to mitigate its effects on countries who, contributed relatively little to the problem, but whose people today are suffering enormously.
And since we're talking about the future, there are some futurists who say that artificial intelligence, for example, could make a large percentage of the future human population somewhat redundant. When you hear things like that, does it worry you? I mean, how does AI and our technological future, is that going to present a threat to the protection and preservation of human rights?
It does present a threat. And let me just give you an example. Human Rights Watch has been very involved in trying to stop what we call killer robots. That is to say, weapons using AI that are basically instructed, go out, find the target, and kill it without any human control. That's an extraordinarily dangerous phenomenon. We've had the vast majority of governments around the world agree with us that these kind of killer robots should be banned. But certain governments, including the United States, Russia, and China, are reluctant to agree. So that's just one illustration. But I think more broadly, there is a need to be much more attentive to technology than we have been. If you take, for example, the social media platforms, there's much talk about suppressing disinformation and the like. But I think what we really need to look at is the algorithms that end up promoting information that is engaging, even when that information is false. Often false or hateful information is very engaging, is profitable. The algorithms promote it, and that's why we have the problem. So there is, I think, a need to go beyond the somewhat simplistic, do you take it down or not, and begin to examine those algorithms.
Before we run out of time, Ken, I was trying to remember how many times we have spoken on the air, and it's countless times over the past decade. And, I have to let our viewers know, you have always made it a point to make yourself available to us in the media. Have journalists, in your experience the past 3 decades, have they done all that they can to tell the truth about the plight of people and human rights violations?
Journalists are very much our allies. I mean, of course, everybody can do more. But, a key way that Human Rights Watch gets things done is by, spotlighting governmental abuses. Fortunately, in today's world, every government has to at least pretend that it respects human rights as a basic aspect of its legitimacy. And so when we can spotlight the discrepancy between that pretense and the ugly reality, that puts pressure on them. That's shameful. It delegitimizes them. Journalists are essential partners in that effort. They report on our findings. They do their own investigations. And so, we do really look at journalism and free media as an essential component of the defense of human rights.
Kenneth Roth, the head of Human Rights Watch, soon to be the former head of Human Rights Watch. Ken, we appreciate your time and your insights. We wish you all the best in a well-deserved retirement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the day is almost done. The conversation continues online. You'll find us on Twitter, either at DW News. You can follow me on Twitter at Brent Goff TV. And remember, whatever happens between now and then, tomorrow is another day. We'll see you then, everybody.